example of pride going before the fall. And I have to tell you, I still have the scabs to prove 2 weeks later, this constant reminder of getting a little wet is not the worst thing in the world, and we could be a little more, your pastor could be a little more humble on most occasions. So I have the little physical God's reminder of that. Still, you can see it on my leg. And I think that there's always a struggle between pride and humility in we humans. We hear it in the Bible, and it's throughout all of our history, especially here in this country. Do we raise ourselves up as better than the rest, believing that what we have and what we are is solely due to our own making? Or do we recognize that all we have is by the grace of God and is given to us in order to serve one another? Our forefathers in faith knew something about this humility. When the Pilgrims first came to this country, and those are the ancestors, part of the ancestors of the United Church of Christ, they first came to this country seeking freedom to worship God the way they chose. So they boarded the Mayflower, which was originally bound for the colony of Virginia, as most of you might recall from your second grade history lessons. But this is something I didn't really remember. The Mayflower excursion was financed by the Company of Merchant Adventurers of London. Doesn't sound like a group that might sponsor pilgrims, does it? But there were two groups on that ship. The Saints, as was written by the Pilgrims, which were the Pilgrims themselves, the people of faith, and those they called the Strangers, who were made up mostly of tradesmen and adventurers. Well, storms forced them to anchor at the hook of Cape Cod, which is now Massachusetts, and it was unwise to continue further south because their provisions were running short. So this inspired some of the strangers to proclaim that since the settlement would not be made in the agreed-upon Virginia territory, that they would, quote, use their own liberty, for none had the power to command them. Well, the Pilgrims realized that this was a bad idea because there were only a certain amount of men, and there were children and women, and it was winter. And so to prevent this, the Pilgrims chose to establish a compact, the Mayflower Compact. And it was based on what they call a majoritarian model. It was in essence a social contract in which all of these settlers, these new settlers, consented to follow the compact's rules for the sake of the survival of everyone. Just as a spiritual covenant based on the biblical principles of humility, placing God first and serving others, had marked the beginning of their congregation back in Europe, a civil covenant was brought together to provide a basis for a secular government in America, declaring that all would need to look out for everyone else if we were all to survive. And then as time went on, more and more wayfarers poured in to this young America, to its shores, seeking a new and a better life. Yet the struggle between pride and humility continued in our history. Some built their wealth by enslaving others. St. Augustine said, "It was pride that changed angels into devils. It is humility that makes men into angels." And the abolitionists took this to heart. Again, These abolitionists were largely made up of forefathers of the United Church of Christ, which makes me feel proud. Feel proud, have not too much humility, because our forefathers had so much humility. And not only the Congregationalists, but others too, the Presbyterians and others, mounted pressure on the government to stop the practice of slavery. And and a bloody civil war was fought on the premise that God meant all to be free and to share in his promise of freeing the captives from bondage. And the Civil War and its resolution so inspired folks around the world that a man named Edward Laboulaye from France was inspired by the actions of the United States and approached Frederick Bartholdi, a sculptor in the mid-1865s. He wanted to celebrate the freedom and democracy that was first celebrated by these early settlers in the U.S., and he hoped it would be a model of France to do the same. So he proposed this gift, and I put a picture, that's what the picture is on the front of your bulletin. He proposed giving the U.S. a gift that would forever symbolize these ideals. And the Statue of Liberty was conceived. Now, originally, it was just to celebrate freedom. But when this statue came in, we got the statue for free, sure. But it cost something to build a big base and to put it into the harbor. And so a campaign was mounted in order to pay for this pedestal and to put the statue on it. And they had an auction and a fundraiser, and part of the auction was this poem by Emma Lazarus that became later mounted on the base of the Statue of Liberty, because it was believed that it so symbolized who we are as a people. And I wanted to read the poem to you today as a part of the remembrance of how our forefathers and foremothers attempted to remind ourselves to live out this biblical principle that we heard in our scriptures today. Listen now, this is entitled The New Colossus. Not like the brazen giant of Greek fame, with conquering limbs astride from land to land, here at our sea-washed sunset gates shall stand a mighty woman with a torch, whose flame is imprisoned lightning, and her name, Mother of Exiles. From her beacon hand glows worldwide welcome. Worldwide welcome. Her mild eyes command the air-bridged harbor that twin cities frame. Keep, ancient land, your storied pomp, cries she with silent lips. Give me your tired, your poor, your huddled masses yearning to breathe free, the wretched refuse of your teeming shore. Send these, the homeless, tempest-tossed to me. I lift my lamp beside the golden door. So what is humility? Well, let's think a minute about pride. There's a childish kind of pride, of course, where you brag about your accomplishments the kids brought forth, while everyone tries to be polite enough not to roll their eyes while you continue to yammer on and on about how great you are. The worst and more sophisticated pride is found in the Pharisee. And then there's also the grown-up version of the childish pride. A multimillionaire who explains he's self-made, has this kind of pride. He has failed to notice all the gifts that have been given along the way to help him get to where he is. And there's many of us that aren't even multimillionaires who fall in parking lots in the same way. He thinks himself responsible for the good he has. And a more complicated kind of pride can be found in a person who knows that all his good comes from the grace of God, but is sure that God has given such grace to them, not to his neighbors, because God knew that he, unlike the stupid worldly neighbors, would make good use of God's gifts. And finally, the worst and most sophisticated kind of pride is found in the Pharisee who thanked God that he was not like the other man, especially not like the sinner. The Pharisee knew that every good in him was a gift from God, but he was glad that he had God's gifts and that the sinner didn't. The Pharisee liked looking down on the sinner. So here's what humility is then. It is recognizing that every good in ourselves is a gift from God and is meant to be given back to the Lord in service to others, sharing with others. Jesus was someone in the image and likeness of God. Jesus had within himself, in the place where it matters most, complete openness to love and serve. He received it and he let it flow through him to others. And so the question is, do you and I dare to call ourselves a human being deep within our own selves in imitation of Jesus? Are we capable of making room inside ourselves for that kind of love? The kind of love the Pilgrims showed, the kind of love the Statue of Liberty outlines as of the ideals we have as people. If we gradually allow it, will love incarnate come to live in us? Will we unite with this deep image and likeness of God in which we're created? Will we be able to act and know that it is God acting within us and through us? If we addict ourselves to things, as Jeremiah warned, instead, if we exalt ourselves, as Jesus puts it in the gospel, we will wrap our souls in layer after layer of mud, like Yertle the turtle. We will try to become our possessions, try to become what other people think of us, what culture manipulates us to be. Jesus says, when you give a banquet, invite the poor, the crippled, the lame, and the blind. You will be blessed, not because they can repay you, not for what they can do for you. You will be repaid at the resurrection of righteousness. So we are challenged once again in our place and time to decide what ideals we are going to follow. Shall we hoard our gifts with pride? Or shall we invite all to share and to serve as Jesus instructed? After all is said and done, we can, in fact, prove ourselves worthy of these great gifts given to us by God and by those who came before us. If we conduct our affairs with humility, we'll allow God to love us and live within us and through us. And we will make a bold difference in this world today. We will become the image and likeness of God's tolerance, shining forth like a beacon on a hill or a flame beside the golden door. And all God's people said, Amen.
As God has welcomed us, let us